afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce Trade Webinar. My name is BC Adeyemi. I'm the Deputy President at the NBCC. Before we go into the webinar conversation, the panel conversation, I'd just like to introduce you to the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce by sharing with you our vision, which is to be the foremost channel of trade and commerce between Nigeria and Britain. And our mission is to continually encourage and promote mutually beneficial trade relations between Nigeria and Britain. And our cardinal goals are trade facilitation, influencing policy, communicating government policy, networking, and enriching membership experience. To anchor this afternoon's discussion is Mrs. Bola Adesola, Senior Vice Chairman, Africa Standard Chartered Bank. I'll now hand over to Mrs. Adesola. Mrs. Adesola. You're on mute.
And yes, thank you very much, BC, for that introduction, and many thanks to the NBCC for inviting me to moderate this session. Good afternoon to everyone online. You're most welcome to this webinar. And today, our focus will be on the Nigeria-Britain bilateral relationship post-COVID-19. As we all know, it is apparent that COVID-19 pandemic presents an unprecedented disruption to the global economy and world trade, as production and consumption has declined across the globe. The World Trade Organization, WTO, predicts that the pandemic will cause a double-digit decline in trade volumes across every sector and region in the world in 2020. The implication for this decline in global trade is that the pandemic will undermine countries' efforts to foster increased trade and investment, and will also jeopardize economic growth and development plans. 4 months ago, the UK-Africa Investment Summit, which I was privileged to attend, laid the foundation for new partnerships between the UK and Nigeria, well, Africa more broadly, but Nigeria in particular, for the purpose of this webinar, based on trade, investment, shared values, and mutual interest. And both nations signed commercial deals worth around £324 million at the summit. And this was much celebrated after. These commercial deals were positioned to create lasting new partnerships, deliver more investment, jobs, and growth opportunities for people and businesses across Nigeria and the UK. In light of the effect of the current pandemic on Nigeria-British trade, which we'll delve into a little bit more during the discussion, and in response to the measures being undertaken by both the Nigerian and British governments to gradually reopen their respective economies to business, the NBCC has considered it expedient to host the webinar on Nigeria-Britain bilateral relationships post the pandemic. This webinar will serve, as part of our objective, as an informative platform to discuss the plans and expectations for Anglo-Nigerian bilateral relationship in the coming months. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome and introduce our distinguished speakers for today. Harriet Thompson, who is the British Deputy High Commissioner to Nigeria, is one of our speakers. Harriet leads a large and growing mission covering the full spectrum of the UK's work in Nigeria, with a particular focus on commercial and economic development. And previously, Harriet had enjoyed a varied career working across the British government, leading policy and programs across trade, energy, climate change, and other areas. Ms. Thompson, you're most welcome to the webinar today. We also have with us Prince Bimbo Olashore, who is the Vice President of the Nigeria-British Chamber of Commerce. Bimbo is a seasoned investment banker who over the years has acquired in-depth knowledge and vast experience in the capital market. Mr. Prince Olashore retired as the CEO of Lead Capital PLC, and is the Chairman, Board of Governors of Olashore International School. You're both, Prince Olashore, you're most welcome.
Thank you very much.
I must say here that thank you. The speaker, Mr. Kayode Falowo, who was supposed to have joined Harriet in this panel, unfortunately, a challenge arose overnight, and Prince Falowo couldn't make it, and so Prince Olashore has stepped in. But as Vice President of the NBCC, he also is well positioned and experienced and exposed to be able to share perspectives through the Nigeria lens. Now, in opening our discussion today, I would like to start by asking each of you, both of you, to briefly reflect for about 4 or 5 minutes on the crisis and how it has affected you personally, your organizations, your employees. So before we go into the Nigeria-British and post-COVID, just personally, how are you feeling now having been through the lockdown, and what's your sort of state of mind currently and going forward? We'll take Harriet first. Thank you.
Thanks, Bola, and to the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce, thanks so much for having me this morning to join you. Bola, that's a really interesting question to start with. You mentioned the Africa Investment Summit as you were speaking, and I have to say it feels like a lifetime ago. That the period from January to now has taken a long time to come, these 5 months. So how it's affected me personally? Well, with the closure of the airports in Nigeria, my husband and my children have been sent back to the UK by my employer. So Bola, I know that you will sympathise. I'm missing them enormously. They're having a wonderful time back in the UK, so I'm trying to be happy about that rather than sorry that I'm not with them. But from a work perspective, I mean, it's had huge implications. We've obviously had to really shift the focus of the work that we, the British government, are undertaking here in Nigeria. And for me particularly, that has meant a huge increase in trying to get British people home to the UK who've been stranded in Nigeria. It's just a sign of how close the relationships are between our two countries and between our peoples. The number of British people who were here at the point at which the airports closed and therefore needed to get home. And when I say here, Lagos has been the absolute epicenter of this. So that's been a huge impact for me. But at the same time, all of the work that really comes out of the mission in Lagos particularly, but my colleagues in Abuja as well, around supporting the economic development of Nigeria, growing the private sector, it becomes even more important, even more relevant as we try to limit the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic, let alone the health impact. So yeah, so I'm missing my family. Work has become more important, I would say, than ever. And on a separate note, my dog and my dog's been left with me rather than going with the kids. He's still here, so you might hear from him at some point. He's very noisy, and I'll apologise now just in case you hear barking at some point on this call. Thanks, Bola. Nice to be here.
So thank you very much, Harriet, for your forthrightness and openness with how you've been coping. Prince Olashore, how are you feeling?
Thank you very much, Bola. It's been very interesting. I happened to be in Europe in January and February when it was really hitting over there. And the mood then was more like, oh, it's a problem that is over the winter months, and by summer, it should be over. And that we might just be spared in Africa. So you can imagine, I think I arrived back in Lagos in the middle of February. And on arriving, we heard news that you had to go into quarantine because I was coming from an high-risk area. So I spent 2 weeks at home by myself and my wife. And guess what? As I was finishing the 2 weeks of my own self-isolation, that's when Nigeria went into its lockdown for 4 weeks. But what it did, it allowed me to quickly adjust. I must say, we all started this year full of optimism, thinking that things are really going to blossom. And this happened and turned up on our doorstep. But for me, it's been a period of adjustment. Working from home is now something that we're all getting used to. As I'm quite lucky that I don't have day-to-day executive responsibilities in most of my businesses. It's either I'm chairman or a board director. So it was relatively easy to move all my meetings online. And I think the problem with the online that we are all now doing is that it's kept us more than busy. You believe it, every day you have all kinds of meetings that are scheduled. I've tried to maintain a general routine, even working from home. I tend to come downstairs by 8:30, 9 a.m. and go back around 5. So it's almost like a full work day. So I think I've fully imbibed the working from home, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. So I think it's now the new normal. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much to both of you for sharing your personal emotions with us. And I'm sure that for most of the people listening, we also echo those sentiments in our lives. So moving on to the meat of the day, the panel discussion, there are a few areas I think that will be beneficial to the participants for us to discuss. The first one that we'll touch on is the ease of doing business. So starting again with distinguished Deputy High Commissioner, could you share with us from the UK lens what challenges UK businesses and investors are currently facing in doing business in Nigeria? You know, what's the outlook for foreign investment and for British companies in the short to medium term? Harriet.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure as this audience can imagine, the impact of coronavirus around the world has really changed the economic outlook, the prospects for British businesses, for all businesses, and that's true of the companies that we have here in Nigeria as well as any other. The challenges that our companies here face are similar, I would say, to those that Nigerian companies face in doing business in Nigeria, and indeed other companies here as well. And actually some of them, many of them hold true, you know, before the coronavirus pandemic hit, and they're around ease of doing business. In the years that I've been in Nigeria, it's been great to see Nigeria steadily rising up the World Bank's doing business rankings. And that's testament to some of the great work that various bits of the government of Nigeria at state level and federal level, PEBEC, but many others have been doing. But we all know, and you as business people on the call today will absolutely know, that there are issues remaining, be those around moving goods into the ports, now of course also moving goods around the country, around forex, around bureaucracy and land registration, all of these things, these issues continue. One of the things that we've been really pleased to see recently is a set of very strong commitments from the federal government of Nigeria that they set out in their letter of intent to the IMF around removing the fuel subsidy, around tackling the forex regime, around the power sector, these changes that we really need to see that are absolutely crucial. I think pushing those through at this point would send a very strong message to the companies that are in Nigeria already, be they British or Nigerian or any other, but also those who are looking around at the moment and in an even more fragile global economic context, thinking about where they might want to be doing business next. On the other hand, some of the steps that have been taken to tackle the spread of COVID-19, which obviously is absolutely crucial, have come at a heavy economic cost. And I'm particularly thinking about those measures that have stopped goods from moving around the country, so disrupting supply chains, including for essential goods to tackle the pandemic and to maintain production of food, for example. We know that it's people, it's not goods, that spread the coronavirus. And allowing the movement of all goods would help businesses, help ordinary citizens, including the most vulnerable, not to be as damaged as they might be by the impact of this disease, I suppose. It's a great opportunity to implement now reforms such as the single window, which the federal government has committed to, which would help to mitigate the impact of coronavirus on the economy and to enable a recovery then, when we get to that point, that promotes a far more diversified and a sustainable economy. So that's something that would be good for British businesses, Nigerian businesses, all the rest of them. Now, at this time, the UK is still highly active in supporting Nigeria to see through some of these reforms. So, for example, we're providing technical assistance to organisations like PEBEC, to NIPC. We've got various programmes that are supporting infrastructure, agriculture, markets, skills, the tech sector. All of these carry on, but in a slightly different way. So, for example, as we're seeing on this webinar now, we're doing far less face-to-face. We're finding virtual ways to do mentoring, providing technical assistance. We are very cognizant of the fact that the demands of the response to coronavirus mean that we have to really focus on the priorities and the priorities now. So we're carrying on with all of that work with a different focus and with different working methods. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Harriet. I mean, and it's gratifying that you also you've mentioned about that the UK is highly active, particularly in terms of technical assistance to support some of the key priority sectors in Nigeria. And Nigeria sent a message also that it remains open for business and commitments to ensure that flows continue to come in. And if I move to Prince Olashore now, and expanding on the question a little bit more through the Nigerian lens, how do we get more British investment? What do you think, what more can the Nigerian government do to get British investment in and to maintain the existing ones? And I say this because the lens through which Harriet, as one of the reps of the British government, is a bit different from what you see on the ground, particularly from Nigerian companies that are also here and that are doing business with British companies. So what do you think we can do more?
Okay, thank you very much. I always believe there's always silver lining at the end of every cloud. At the end of the day, COVID-19 is giving us an opportunity to do some of the things we've been talking about in the past. From a Nigerian business environment and for Nigerian companies in particular, COVID has given us some challenges. Okay, we already have infrastructural challenges, we had business challenges, but guess what? A number of those things are now being addressed. I mean, for sure, we're already moving in the right direction. You can see we're moving up the scale of ease of doing business. But clearly, there are one or two things that have now happened that clearly will make things a lot easier. One is the harmonization of the exchange rate. I think there's an area Nigerians have been going on about some time, and instead of coming up with the harmonization, clearly it's a move in the right direction. There are some investments that are going on that hopefully will make the environment a bit more competitive. The investment we are seeing in health now, over the past, we're talking about our budgetary allocation to health and education. All of a sudden, COVID had now made that experience for us to work on. And for sure, that kind of investment will continue. The cost of governance is an area that clearly we need to work on. And I'm quite pleased that we are seeing movement from government's end on cost of doing a business. But the reality of it is that there's still a lot to do. Supply chain has been disrupted. And even though there are opinions to this, the mere fact that from government perspective, they've tried to keep the budget still high, means that they still want to go ahead with the investments that they already budgeted for. We know the budget is slightly lower. What that means is that there'll be a higher level of government borrowing to finance what they need to do. But bearing in mind our infrastructural deficit, we clearly have to continue with that investment along those lines. So the key is to continue having investment in infrastructure, obviously trying to ensure cost of governance comes down, ensure that the environment is certainly much more competitive. And clearly, we really must build on some of the reforms that we have started. The key is the political will to see us through. And the much talked about diversification of the economy, hopefully, we should stop paying lip service to that. The fact that we have oil being the mainstay of our foreign exchange earnings is something we really need to focus on. So the increased focus now on agri and other sectors of the economy, I think, is something that is quite positive. The key is for all of us now to key into the emerging areas. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Prince Olashore. I mean, the key thing with ease of doing business, as you both have said, is that we need to help government also to enhance the cost of doing business as well in Nigeria, and some of the commitments that the government has made in terms of FX harmonization and infrastructure as well. I want us to now consider Brexit. I don't know if anybody remembers Brexit, given the fact that COVID has taken over in our vocabulary. Maybe not even COVID, but COVID-exit, so that we get rid of COVID as soon as possible. But if we consider Brexit and the urgent focus of the Nigerian government to diversify its earnings and stimulate growth in exports. Prince Olashore, what export opportunities do you think exist for the African continent and Nigeria in particular with the exit of Britain from the EU? Because it's not just a one-way, we also have to look at how we can generate more foreign exchange. You're mute.
Clearly, the first thing is to try and move up the value chain in some of the things that we do. We should just stop being a continent that produces just or exports only primary air products. So it is quite key that we must be a lot more value added in our own environment. I mean, the key thing again is not just about value added, it's also about moving up the quality scale. If you want to export into Europe or any of these markets, you really must meet their own standards. But clearly, we still have opportunities for us in Nigeria in cocoa, sesame seeds, rubber, ginger. These are our primary things. But also bear in mind that we also need to develop our solid minerals. We've always said Nigeria is not just an oil economy. The economy is certainly much more diversified than that. So there are these products that we also need to get involved in. Also bear in mind that if we improve on our infrastructure, we should look at what the countries like India has done, in which outsourcing has been a very major area. And even if we can also build on infrastructure, manufacturing base can go up. You can see whether we like it or not, even though a lot of countries are now looking inwards, trying to do manufacturing home. You should be that companies will still look for where they can have a lower cost of manufacturing. And I think Nigeria can be a base for that, given our sizable economy in terms of the numbers that we have. And also bearing in mind that if I look at UK in particular, the fact that we have the same common law environment, we speak the same language, almost the same time zone, it gives us a lot of opportunities for us to take advantage of the fact that as they go into Brexit, they are looking to more partners they can get from outside Europe, and Nigeria can just take advantage of that. So the key for us is to get our own act together, improve on our infrastructure, improve on the cost of doing business, and clearly really can take advantage of what we are seeing. And our position in Africa, even given our closeness to Europe, gives us a unique opportunity to take advantage of some of the things that are currently being done in India and the Far East, for it to come on to Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prince Olashore. You know, Harriet had mentioned some of the technical assistance areas. I believe that those are mainly to support us as we go through COVID and maybe post. But you mentioned something interesting, outsourcing. As we've seen, you know, the likelihood of job losses and so on, Nigeria could very well be a key outsourcing center for technology support. And this may be an area, Harriet, that you know, you could look at and take a leaf from what Prince Olashore has said. So if we go on to the UK Africa Investment Summit, which you know, Harriet also mentioned, it's been 5 months since, and I must say I attended that, and it was an excellent gathering of individuals, businesses, and governments. So Harriet, I'd like you to touch on what progress has been made on the various announcements from the summit. I mean, I'll just mention a couple. The UK government and the DIT, the Department for International Trade, committed 13.1 billion naira investment promotion program for Nigeria and South Africa to stimulate FDI and facilitate technology and knowledge transfer. There's also the £55 million land transformation facility to help the, and also 320 million pounds to help the UK financial sector deepening platform support companies here. So what's happened since the summit? I know you had some post-summit meetings, Harriet, but subsequently, any progress being made right now? It would be great if you could share with us, please.
Yeah, so one of the highlights of the last fortnight for me was the first in what will become a series of quarterly meetings between Honourable Minister Adebayo and the top executives of around 10 of our biggest British companies here in Nigeria, giving them that opportunity to talk, I was going to say face-to-face, virtually face-to-face, about some of the key issues that are affecting them, to hear the minister's views on how those issues might be addressed. So it's just bringing into the present some of those relationships that were established at the Africa Investment Summit and helping to build the understanding between the two sides so that we can really get to grips with the issues that are affecting businesses. The businesses can understand at the same time the constraints that the government is under, and they can hopefully begin to work together to come up with some solutions. So as I say, the first of those meetings happened last week, slightly losing track of time, but I think it was last week, and that should become a regular thing now. We're hoping also to be able to do the similar, the equivalent meeting for Nigerian businesses as well. So of course, in due course, we'll be talking to the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce, getting that set up. So that's one of the ways that we've kind of continued to build the relationships and the understanding. In terms of some of the progress on the commitments that were made at the summit, sadly, one of the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic is that these programs have been slower to get off the ground than we might have hoped. So the investment promotion program that you mentioned, Bola, that is still at the scoping phase as we work out now how we can do that in the way that's most useful, most relevant to the current economic climate, both in the UK and here in Nigeria. So we're moving ahead, but we're not moving ahead as quickly as we had liked. However, there's another one, the Growth Gateway Programme, which is £37 million of business support services for trade and investment across Africa. That's about to start now. Nigeria is going to see something I also wanted to touch on technology, which was a big area of focus for the Africa Investment Summit, hugely important in Nigeria, where the sector is growing about 3 times faster than the rest of the economy. And although obviously we've seen that growth slow down during the coronavirus pandemic, the increased reliance of all of us now on our technology highlights the real opportunities that there are there for companies right here in Nigeria to benefit. And it sounds wrong to be talking about benefiting from such a terrible set of circumstances, but the fact is that we all need technology more than ever. So the work that we're doing with the tech sector now, with programs that are being rolled out despite the current circumstances. So helping to understand how we can support innovation and local production of products like PPE that we need to help manage coronavirus, understanding the impact of coronavirus on the tech sector in Nigeria, to understand how we can support digital healthcare, how we can support those Nigerian companies who are in that sphere to do more at the moment. That's one of the areas where we have been able to really move at pace despite everything. Well, in part because of what's happening at the moment. So not as fast progress as we'd have liked in some areas, but equally in others, there have been these opportunities where we've been able to pivot in. Bola, you're on mute.
Thank you. The fact that, for example, you've organized these quarterly meetings between the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment and the biggest British companies means that there's dialogue for engagement, because I think it's very easy for us to default into COVID as a reason why we're not doing stuff. So thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you also for sharing what you're doing in the tech sector. But I want to also see, how are you getting this information out there? How are you, because if not for this webinar, I'm sure most of the people on the line would not realize that all these things are going on and that the British government is actively supporting the Nigerian government. What's the communication strategy which will, attract beneficiaries of the, technical support, whether it's technical support or financial assistance? What are you doing about getting the information out there?
Yeah, so I mean, in general terms, the standard communications channels of the British government in Nigeria still remain very active. So our social media, my colleagues who know far more about Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all the rest of it, they're still very active. And then in terms of the programs themselves, so the people that we have working on that suite of IT programs, tech programs, the people who we have working on the financial inclusion programs and so on, those people, and some of them have been sent back to the UK now, but the wonders of technology mean that they can continue that engagement with the people who are involved in those sectors in much the same way as they were able to before the coronavirus epidemic hit and before we all moved to home working. So happily, although we've had to shift the focus and we have had to change the ways of working, we are still able to reach out to those people who need to be or could be involved in that programme activity in much the same way as we were able to do before.
So thank you, Harriet. Whilst you're at it in terms of what you've been doing specifically, I'm sure you're aware that women in particular have borne a significant brunt of the pandemic in Nigeria and even Africa more broadly. Has there been any particular gender lens that you have looked through in terms of the support that you've given so far and the discussions you've been having?
Yeah, I mean, so we are trying to understand precisely what the impact of coronavirus has been on women in Nigeria. I think there's so much that we don't know about this virus, about the effects of the virus, both in terms of health, but also the economy right the way across the world. And of course, that holds true in Nigeria as well. A lot of our economic development programs were geared anyway towards women. So I hope that by continuing that, we're able to mitigate the worst of the impact on women. So that is, for example, support in terms of bringing more women into the formal financial sector, so that so many of these small businesses that are run by women are able to be supported by access to credit, for example, and to affordable loans by bringing them into the formal banking sector, formal finance sector. a lot of our skills programs are geared at women. Those programs that go towards developing markets, that support the use of technology in agriculture. These things will, by the nature of the workforce involved in those areas in Nigeria, will benefit women and therefore help to mitigate the impact on that particularly vulnerable group. But as I say, there's a huge amount that we still need to learn about the impact of coronavirus in Nigeria, both in terms of health and in terms of the economy. Bola, you're on mute.
It's great. They mute me, actually, the host does. It's good to know that you know, there is you know, some focus on women, but we also want to get this information out there. I'd just like to say here that for participants, please drop your questions in the Q&A box and your comments on the chat box. We're monitoring that, and when we get to Q&A, we will bring that up. Harriet, I'm going to focus on you again before I go back to Prince Olashore. You know, the current pandemic has tested the health system in all the affected countries, and we are all aware, and we see on the news, and we have, you know, relatives also who live in the UK, about how stretched the National Health Service, the NHS, is. And indeed, the health workers are doing a splendid job of saving lives 24/7. I know that, you know, you're not necessarily the health expert, but are there one or two lessons that you know, that can be applied also from UK NHS to Nigeria? I've seen already on the Q&A that there's some questions in terms of support for the health sector, so you may even want to roll that in as well. What lessons can we learn, one or two, from, you know, how the UK NHS has coped, and what role did the private healthcare sector in the UK play in supporting them that we can learn in Nigeria, and what support can you give us here as well?
So we've been working primarily through the Department for International Development with the health sector in Nigeria for a very long time. It accounts for a huge amount of our spend here in Nigeria. We also have and have had for a number of years now staff of Public Health England, so our public health body, working with the NCDC, and that continues throughout this epidemic as well. So some really strong partnerships there, and a huge amount of money that goes from the UK into Nigeria's health system. Yeah, we're very proud of the NHS in the UK. We're very fond of the NHS, and one of the things that's been a real positive, I think, throughout this has been the way that the British people come out once a week to applaud our key workers, particularly those in the NHS. Every Thursday evening, you'll see people coming out to say thank you. And it's so important that we remember and acknowledge and are grateful for the incredibly important work that those people are playing. One of the things that governments across the world have tried to do, and in the UK of course as well, is to ensure that the health systems are not pulled under by the number of people who are affected by coronavirus. And it's been interesting to see that although the infection rate is so high, obviously the mortality rate is lower than we've seen in some other epidemics, and perhaps lower than we feared we might see with coronavirus, but still the impact on the health systems had the potential to be enormous. So one of the key things that the government has tried to do in the UK is to manage the numbers and to slow the spread of the virus. So we're aware that we can't stop the spread of the virus, but to slow it to the extent where the health service isn't swamped. At the peak of the virus, well, as numbers were higher in the UK, we did see some of the private clinics be pulled into the response. So some of the private hospitals gave up their beds and their wards and their facilities to public sector clients, so people who needed support for coronavirus. So we were able to bolster the capacity of our public health system by doing that. The numbers have come right down again now in the UK. There is, of course, the worry that they might go up, so people are being asked to stay alert, to be careful. We're still enforcing social distancing and strict conditions on when people can go out still, but those numbers have come right down, and it's really heartening to know that when they were at their peak, the National Health Service coped, because we were able to draw in that additional capacity and to avoid the peak getting too high. So I think that's one of the key things for Nigeria to look at. I think it's really important that the government is thinking about the economic impact of their responses, and we saw therefore the relaxation of the lockdown in various respects a couple of weeks ago, but we'll need to keep a real careful watch on the numbers, and if those start going back up again and there's the risk then of them getting to such an extent as to overwhelm the health system, then we'll need to be able to respond quickly, react, and put those lockdown measures back in place if that proves to be necessary. It's a careful balancing act.
Excellent, thank you very much. I mean, it's moved from stay home to stay alert and managing the numbers. I believe that certainly Lagos State is taking one or two leaves from what's been happening in the UK in terms of the curve and managing and the gradual lockdown and so on. But thank you for sharing in a bit more detail how the UK is coping. And I will just throw this in here that because I saw one of the questions that had been sent in earlier was about the UK considering low skilled to high skilled. The healthcare workers had always been considered low skilled, even in terms of immigration and so on. And how now they're hopeful that they will now be classified as highly valuable. Let me not say skilled, but highly valuable. I'll switch over before we go into the general, before answering the specific questions that have been sent in. So Prince Olashore. Prince Olashore, you are a capital markets guru. I mean, very experienced and have successfully run Lead Merchant Bank, Lead Capital, and so understand what's happening. So what is the outlook for the Nigerian capital market post-COVID? Would you share your thoughts with us, please?
Well, given my capital market background, I'll obviously say the outlook is extremely positive. But one thing everybody should look at when you talk about the capital market, especially when people look at the stock prices, I always tell people the market is for the medium to long term. It was never meant to be a short-term play. So the outlook was based on what you think will happen in the medium to long term. Now, we've spoken about Nigeria. We've spoken about the positive things happening. So that tells you that the outlook is bound to be what? Bound to be positive. For us, specifically now, when the outbreak first started, clearly because of the uncertainty, share prices came down. The markets do not like uncertainty. And based on that, the markets all came down. But as clarity started turning up, what happened? The market started going up. Now we're very clear which industries are doing well and which ones will be adversely affected. Clearly, in the short term, airline industry is affected. Obviously, if you're in petrol retailing, is affected. If you're in logistics, if you're in retail, if you're in hospitality businesses, all that will be affected. So obviously, if you have a market that is dominated by companies listed there, you'll have a downward effect. But at the same time, there's some positive areas. If you're in infrastructure, if you're in technology, if you're in telecoms, if you're in food, obviously that is an upside. So what have we seen? We've seen the market recovering globally, not just in Nigeria, globally it is recovering. Even the oil prices, that was a drag on Nigeria. There was a time, I think even the Nigerian budget, everything was reduced downwards. People are looking at a $20 price. Now, last time I checked, we have oil now at the range of $35, $36 per barrel. And the outlook is up. So those are the things that underpin the Nigerian capital market. If you have a positive oil price going up, clearly it gives us an ability to fund our budget. So from our own perspective, our particular market is dominated by big infrastructure companies or supply companies like Dangote. You have big companies like MTN. So then you have the banking sector. Initially as well, if you look at the banks, they are bound to be affected because I'm not sure about the exposure, especially to oil and gas. But we have seen that there is a stimulus that is available. We are trying to ensure that companies come through this. And as the economy starts opening up, the doomsday scenario seems to be receding. So what that means is that we are not expecting as much damage that was initially feared. So I do expect the market to be quite more positive. I am quite bullish on Nigeria because of what I call Nigeria's fundamentals. Our issue has always been diversification. Nigeria is not an oil and gas economy. Oil and gas is barely 12% of GDP. It only tells you that all we have to do is stimulate all the other areas. So the increased emphasis on agri, technology, the real growth areas, clearly will underpin the growth in the Nigerian capital market. So my view is that this is a time for anybody that is really believing more in the medium to long term to really pile on. There is really no cause for alarm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bimbo. I know that there are partnership structures between the stock exchange in Nigeria and certainly the London Stock Exchange. So I hope that the technical support that Harriet is talking about will also be extended to that area now. So we'll go into general Q&A, and there's several questions. I'll try and group them together because we don't have much time left. The first one is for Harriet, and there are two questions in relation to education. And the questions are as follows. How is the UK government supporting the Nigerian education sector during COVID, specifically in terms of digital education? And the part two of that, also asked by the same participant, is will the UK government or the FCO work with educational institutions to fast-track student visas for Nigerian students headed to the UK or going back to school in the UK? So support, particularly in terms of educational, digital education and learning. And the second one is, given COVID and the closure of the High Commissions, I believe, will there be a fast track for student visas for students heading back to the UK? Harriet.
Thank you. Two excellent questions. So to take the first one, education is another huge area of support from the UK to Nigeria and has been for very many years. All of that has continued throughout this pandemic. And as we've seen the lockdown measures, we've been looking at, both through our education programme, but also through the support into the tech sector, how we can support those excellent providers in Nigeria of digital content for schools. So there's some really, really great companies who are doing things at quite small scale, who are supported by some of the innovation hubs. So we're supporting them both through that kind of tech sector route, as well as through some of our education programming and looking at how we need to pivot that to be responsive to the circumstances that we're now facing because of COVID. In terms of visas and education visas, the summer is always a peak time for our visa services because people want to visit the UK to see family during those summer holidays, and also because of the number of students who want to get to the UK in order to start courses in September. This year it could be different given the restrictions on global travel still, given the introduction shortly of the 2-week quarantine period on people coming into the UK, and given the restrictions on schools and their operating hours and the need for them to introduce processes that allow for social distancing in schools, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about how all this is going to look between now and September. So I am expecting the picture to become a lot clearer over the next couple of months. We see updated guidance coming out periodically from the British government about the education establishment as well as about travel. So I'm hoping that I'll have better answers to those questions over the next couple of weeks to couple of months. But our visa team are doing their planning to restart their services at the point at which that becomes appropriate. So we're watching carefully, as I'm sure everybody else is, to see what the federal government of Nigeria's intentions are around the resumption of commercial international flights. And that will be a key deciding factor in when we restart our visa services in Nigeria. But if we're in a position of there being commercial flights running and of the schools in the UK being ready to accept pupils again in September through whatever are the restrictions that are in place at the time, then we will find a way to process those applications for Nigerian applicants wanting to go continue their studies or start their studies in the UK.
Thank you very much, Harriet. I want to turn to another area where we've had a few questions, and it's in relation to tourism and how the NBCC and the British High Commission in Nigeria could maybe work together in the area of tourism. And I'll read the question. It's a bit long, but I'll try. One of the major areas of export and earning foreign exchange often overlooked is tourism. Tourism spans almost every sector of the economy, this individual's organization has its head office in the UK. The organization is West Africa Tourism Organization, and they just opened in Lagos. And they would like to know what sort of relationship can be built between the NBCC and the British High Commission in Nigeria. Travel and tourism is in dire need of every support at this trying period. There was a second question also on tourism in the Q&A, but I'll leave that for now. If you could just sort of address any areas of support that the British government can give Nigeria. Obviously, the infrastructure challenges and so on and so forth, but is that an area that could be looked into at all?
So personally speaking, I would love to see more tourism to Nigeria. Nigeria has some fantastic sites, some fantastic events, and having more people come to Nigeria to involve those would be brilliant for all sorts of reasons, not just Nigeria's economy. So I'd love to see it happen. I know that my colleague, Paul Gray, who's the Director of Department for International Trade, based here with me in Lagos, is on this call. So I'll ask him just to make a note of that. I think the key thing that the concrete step we can take is to have the lead in his team to pick up with the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce and to have an exploratory meeting with the membership who are involved in that sector to understand the art of the possible. So what are the areas of support? What are the things that we could do? How could we look to partner in that area? I would just say though, Bola, as you mentioned, those key questions around infrastructure, they are always going to provide us with a limit on how much we can build the tourist sector in Nigeria. If people come here and they can't get into the country easily, if they can't get around the country easily, then obviously that's gonna put people off coming. So all of the work that we're doing with the government of Nigeria at state level and at federal level to address issues like power and like infrastructure are really going to help with the tourist sector as well.
Yeah, I just want to turn quickly to Prince Olashore now. There's a question here, which is, can NBCC facilitate a symbiotic relationship between Nigerian and UK banks, leveraging on the experience and success of UK banks to deepen mortgage banking in Nigeria? And if you could broadly comment on financial services collaboration between the UK and Nigeria from what NBCC is doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I must try and emphasize that NBCC, it's all about facilitating trade between Nigeria and the UK. That's really why we are in business. And we do this on behalf of our members. One thing that is very clear is that part of our membership also are all the major banks. So clearly, we are always at the forefront on what we can do for financial inclusion for both Nigerian businesses, and also how does Nigerian business get access to UK lines. One thing I must comment upon again is that there are also different lines of financial support that are even outside the traditional banking system. One that I must talk about is the export credit line that is even available from UK. Even I must throw that back to UK in that Nigerians, I think we're only about 3% of the total amount that is available. So the key for us is sometimes when people talk about credit, I tell people it's not just about access to credit, it's also the cost of credit to make sure the business is viable. So there are different mechanisms that Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce is involved in to try and ensure that the cost of credit itself comes down through all kind of bilateral relations that we have with UK institutions. So that's an area I want Nigerian companies to take advantage of that. But before I leave that, I must make a comment on the issue of tourism. The issue of tourism is based on two things. One is security, and one is standardization. We must have standards. If you don't have global standards, there's a problem. But we must also bear in mind that we ourselves must build our own domestic tourism. It is on the back of Nigerian domestic tourism that can now have international tourism. So if Nigerians themselves must try and embrace some of the tourist sites. For someone that comes from well outside Lagos, I'm always very surprised how very few people know what is happening even outside the big cities. So we must build our domestic tourism for us to have international tourism also thrive on that. And my comment again must be on education because I'm also involved in that. We must bear in mind that the world is changing and COVID is giving us an opportunity to try different models. Notice from what I'm seeing in education now, we are probably moving past the day where you're going to have on-campus education for all year round. you probably have a combination of distance learning and probably just turn up for 1 or 2 bestowed lessons. And that's what we must try and embrace. Technology has made the world a lot smaller. COVID is accelerating some of the things that technology is going to bring to bear, even in the space of technology. The model of brick and mortar globally is probably changing. And we've seen 1 or 2 institutions, even in the UK, that have announced, even if schools are opened, they intend to still do their lessons online over the next 1 year. So I think we all have to try and understand that the world is changing, and we really have to adapt to that. So clearly, NBCC is at the forefront of helping our members in whatever area. And I think on the area of mortgages or banking, clearly there are relationships that are on ground. I noticed somebody has had that question in the Q&A, and I think we've also posted how you can reach us so you can get much more details on the collaborations that are available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prince Olashore. And I actually should have also addressed the educational question to you as you chair one of the finest educational institutions in Nigeria, Olashore International School. So thank you for chipping that in. You touched on security, and that takes me to my next question as we gradually round up to Harriet. Harriet, I know that the British government and also British High Commission here has been very, very supportive over the years to the Nigerian government in the area of security and helping with strategies and so on. Now, given COVID and a lot of what you described that you've been doing in facilitating technology support and other forms of technical assistance, could you let us know whether there's been any shift or reduction in the focus area of security? I know you've done a lot with helping with insurgency in the Northeast. What is the state now of the status rather of British support to the Nigerian government in the area of alleviating the insurgency and the security challenges in the country?
Thanks, Bola. I'm glad you asked. It remains one of our top priorities in the work that we're doing here in Nigeria. So both supporting people who are affected by the insurgency in the Northeast, by far the biggest expenditure that the British government has in Nigeria, sadly, is assistance to people in IDP camps who otherwise would die of starvation, malnutrition, lack of access to basic medicines, for example. All of that absolutely carries on through the course of this pandemic. In fact, it becomes more important. You can imagine the chaos that would be caused should COVID become rampant in some of those IDP camps where overcrowding is such an issue. So that's one side of it. But on the other side as well, our support to the military, particularly, but to some of the other security agencies as well, that continues, as does the work that we do around trying to address some of the longer term drivers of the insurgency, and to turn people away from terrorism, to try to bring an end to this particular crisis, this insurgency, but also then to avoid further examples of terrorism emerging over the years to come. If we look at the security situation, not only in the Lake Chad Basin, but also in other parts of the Sahel in West Africa, it's absolutely clear that we cannot take our attention away from our support to all of the governments who are affected, despite the pressing needs that COVID presents to us. We've got to do both. We can't decide to do one or the other, and certainly we're not in Nigeria. All of that work on security, particularly in the Northeast, continues.
Thank you very much, Harriet, for that reassurance, because we know how much progress has been made with the kind support of the British government over the years in the area of security. I'm going to lump two questions together as we gradually come to a close, and it's specifically on SMEs and agri. I know you've spoken about sectors, but SMEs also span across the sectors, and I think the general impression is that we're talking big business as opposed to the trickle down to the SMEs and the much smaller companies. So it'd be great if you could share with us whether there's been any focus on that band of SMEs that are the engine room of society, those in the supply chain and in the ecosystem of the larger companies. And whilst you're responding to that, if you could talk specifically on agriculture, now it's a lot of it is healthcare and food security. Are there, British companies that are looking at coming in agricultural equipment and so on and so forth? If you could address that, please, that'd be great.
Yeah, so on SMEs, first of all, that's where the growth is going to come from, as I see it, right? The big businesses are big already. They employ a lot of businesses already, a lot of individuals, already. If you can grow an SME, even from sort of 10 people to 20 people, if you do that across enough SMEs, that's an awful lot of additional jobs. So the sorts of areas where we're supporting them, some of this is around skills acquisition. We're supporting a lot of them in the tech sector. And when I say tech sector, that then brings in all sorts of different types of technology. So we've talked about health technology, education technology, agricultural technology. So it supports all of those different areas as well, but it's coming at it through a particular lens. The financial inclusion work that we do is absolutely critical here as well, because getting those companies fully taking advantage of the benefits that being involved in the formal finance sector is absolutely key to allowing them to grow. I'm really pleased that Prince Bimbo Olashore mentioned UK export finance, UK credit earlier, and understanding how we can make better use in Nigeria of a huge amount of money that's available, and that could support SMEs, not just the big businesses, is something that I would love for us to get to grips with as well. So lots of work going on, but I think an area that we need to explore further. I think government having to do things at scale, the temptation is to go with the big companies, but I think working out how we can support the smaller companies to grow is going to be really key. And then in terms of agriculture, this is an absolute area of focus for us. So if we think about the British government's priorities, not just in Nigeria, but more broadly as well, around climate change, around developing livelihoods, around the growth of the private sector, food security in countries like Nigeria, boosting two-way trade between Nigeria and the UK, supporting the economic development of women particularly. For all of these sorts of reasons, agriculture is absolutely key. So in the same way that we haven't sort of dialed down our focus on security, equally understanding how we can support agriculture, particularly now, is one of the areas of focus. And I talked earlier about supply chains and the disruption of movements of goods within Nigeria at the moment. Ensuring that the agriculture sector is not only able to maintain its status quo, but to go forwards. It's so important that we can start moving those essential supplies around Nigeria so that things don't slip backwards. Important for the agriculture sector particularly, but not only, of course. So we continue to explore that. Coming out of the Africa Investment Summit, there were a couple of companies who are really keen to come to Nigeria and to look concretely at the opportunities here. Unfortunately, the global travel situation and the cessation of international commercial flights put that on pause. But it's one of the reasons that we're looking to see carefully what the Nigerian government is planning in that space, to see how we can get that sort of activity going again. We're looking at the kind of virtual trade missions, for example, as a different way of achieving the same objectives. But I think people would agree that there's nothing quite like coming here in person.
Absolutely. In fact, I was going to say, when are the commercial flights starting? Because we need, commercial flights oftentimes, the intensity of it is a proxy for how much business is happening between countries. So thank you very much. To close the session, I'd like to just call on both yourself, Harriet, and Bimbo Olashore, to give your closing remarks and just share one key lesson that you have taken away even from from this discussion, and one key point that you would like to leave the audience with from this webinar. So Harriet, you can continue, and then we'll go to Prince Olashore.
I'm going to start with the key point that I would like to leave the audience with, and I'm sure it's one that you will have heard before, but it is to remember that despite all of the adversity, despite the difficulties that many of us will never have experienced or imagined that we're facing now, there are opportunities there. And Prince Bimbo Olashore mentioned that the outlook is bright. Hold on to that thought, find the opportunities, and the UK is here trying to do that with the Nigerian government. Some of the things that the government has committed to doing now are things that many of us have been calling on them to do, some changes that we wanted them to make for a long time. If they can press ahead and implement those changes, that will not only prevent the worst of the impact from COVID-19, but also address some of the challenges businesses were facing for many years here in Nigeria, and really set Nigeria up on that path for diversified economic growth in future. So I would say hold on to the upsides as well as working out how to deal with the downsides.
Thank you. Hold on to the upsides, work on how to deal with the downsides. It's a bright outlook. Thank you very much, Harriet. Bimbo.
Thank you very much. I think I will build on what Harriet has just said. One thing is for sure, this period shall pass. And if you look at history, periods like this will always throw up winners and losers. The key for you is to see where exactly are the growth opportunities, where exactly can you latch onto. For us in Nigeria, it has been a unique opportunity to try and reset this country. Some of the issues we've been talking about for quite a number of decades is an opportunity for us to try and implement them. And if we're able to do that, I can assure you that clearly we have so many things going for us that should make Nigeria now start positioning itself as one of the most important countries in the world. It's still a large domestic market. Even if we're able to sell goods among ourselves in a competitive manner, that will ensure that buying goods within Nigeria is even cheaper than having to import. We are already on our way. We still have it's still the largest market in Africa. We do agree that we have business challenges, but like you said, we are making steps, positive steps there, the ease of doing business. Even though people might not appreciate it, things are actually, they are improving. There's a number of game changers that are turning up. I always tell people that if Dangote refinery comes on board, it will change even the economics of Nigeria, but people have not really understood what is going on along that Lekki corridor. So it's for us to fast forward to 2-3 years down the road. If most of those projects do come on stream, it will be a different ball game. The key is for everybody to see, where am I positioned? Where are the opportunities? Where can I act? Where you say agric is at the large value chain. You can either be at the primary end, or it can be at the processing end, or even be selling. It depends on where do I want to be. The reality of it all is that the world is now a global village. There is access to information. There is nothing you require that if you just Google that, you will get the information that you need. So the key is for everybody now to be brave. This time for you to be brave and embrace the new normal and ensure that at least you are able to be part of the winners. So I'm quite positive on the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olashore. And this too shall pass, as you say. You know, you've also said international trade triggers and encourages bilateral trade. So we must also look inward, positioning and opportunities, and of course, the right outlook. I'd like to, on behalf of I've been told by the NBCC now that I should just give a vote of thanks to you both and round up. We plan to finish at 3:15, but at 3:05 we're still okay, because I think you've covered a lot. I would like to say that for any of the participants who have asked questions that have not been addressed, the NBCC will try and reach out to you through the email address that you've left when you registered to be able to address those questions. Many of them were personal and in relation to private business. So we felt that we should be more general in terms of what we're discussing here in relation to bilateral trade between the UK and Nigeria. So on behalf of Mr. Kayode Falowo, the President and Chairman in Council of the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce, Prince Bimbo Olashore, the Vice President, and thank you for doing such great justice to being called in within 10 hours, literally, to step in for Mr. Falowo. And the Deputy President, Mrs. Bisi Adeyemi, who has given me this assignment, and who am I not to do it. Thank you to all the participants who have dialed in. You know, both governments, Nigeria and Britain, have put in place palliatives to ease the effect of the pandemic and provide support through various schemes. we thank you both for really focusing on the issues raised and also for the questions from the participants. These are indeed very challenging times, and it's gratifying to see collaboration to foster the growth of trade and investment between our great country, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom. You know, the 17th SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, is about partnerships. And I think that truly the NBCC and the UK representation in Nigeria and the Nigerian government and the UK government are working hand in hand to ensure that the age-old relationship between Nigeria and the UK, culturally, socially, and through business, is not doesn't diminish at this period. I'd like to specifically thank the Deputy High Commissioner Harriet Thompson, a dear friend and one always willing to respond whenever she's asked in Nigeria, for sharing what it is the UK government is doing. I encourage you though, Harriet, that you need to get some more of this information out, because some of the questions that were asked were in relation to how do we get this information, can my small business benefit, and so on. And as WIMBIZ, Women in Management and Business, we will be prepared to help get that out to our network, because many of these SMEs are also women. Thank you very much to the audience for dialing in. Thank you for your participation, for your questions, for your comments. All have been taken to heart. And we pray that as Prince Olashore said, that this too shall pass, that it shall pass quickly, but that we should not also waste the opportunity of a crisis. One of the quotations that I read recently about how people should position and pivot their businesses is that COVID is doing to businesses what competition would like to do to them. So if competition wants to shut you down, if COVID is trying to shut you down, you've got to be able to find those opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed again on behalf of NBCC. Do have a wonderful evening, and I wish you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Prince Olashore.
Thank you.